Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Demystifying ROI for Internal Meetings and Events, How to Define and Calculate ROI with Confidence. My name is Brad Gillespie, and I'll be today's host and speaker. And before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. On the right-hand side of your screen in Attendee Hub, you can join our chat, submit questions in the Q&A. You can also find and fill out our survey for today's session. We certainly appreciate your feedback to help us continuously improve our webinar programs. And last but not least, to download this presentation file, click on the resources link on the right-hand side. Today's session is part 2 of a 3-part series. In case you missed part 1, we covered demystifying ROI for external and commercial events, which is available on demand. Today, we're covering internal meetings and events. And part 3, which will air November 29th, will cover demystifying ROI for event technology. So we hope you will join us for that one as well. My name again is Brad Gillespie. I am GM of Cvent's Consulting Business Unit. I am formerly the head of corporate and enterprise marketing for Cvent. And prior to Cvent, I was a CMO at both Serious Decisions and Octave. Part of my role at Cvent was owning the meetings and events program for a few years. And so I think I can empathize with many of you in our audience today about these challenges that we're going to talk about today. So why is ROI so mystifying, especially for internal meeting and event programs? Well, for one, we don't always set clear objectives for those events and programs. And sometimes we don't even understand what's possible to measure. And when we do, we oftentimes don't have the right metrics available to help us measure. And sometimes we don't know how to quantify the benefits that we are getting or anticipate getting for our internal meetings and events and programs. We're going to address all of these items today because ROI is important now more than ever. ROI helps us understand, should we continue a particular meeting, event, or program? Should we decrease or increase investment? We need to be able to compare how one meeting or event compares to others and answer the question, what do we actually get for the investment in time and money? Finally, understanding ROI helps us set the right goals from the outset. And again, we're going to address all of these topics today. In particular, we're going to answer some key questions. We're going to help you understand how to define your internal meeting, event, and program types, help you understand what's possible to measure, let you see the key metrics and KPIs for measurement, help you understand how to build the right ROI model for your organization, because your organization is unique. And while the ROI model is consistent, the way that you will apply it in each of your organizations is a little different. I'm going to show you how to calculate ROI on these variables for internal meetings, events, and programs, and ultimately how that impacts setting the right goals. So a quick word on metrics and KPIs, because sometimes this does create some confusion. So simply put, metrics are units of measure. And all KPIs are metrics, but not all metrics are KPIs. KPIs should really highlight the most important things you're trying to measure. And ROI is perhaps the most mature KPI possible. So as you'll see along the path of building and understanding ROI, you're going to find other KPIs that may be just as important to your organization as ROI. So you're going to get something out of this regardless of where you are on your journey, and hopefully all the way to the ROI destination. I like to use examples, organizations for exercises like this. And so today we're going to use our friends at Waystar Royco. And like all organizations, Waystar Royco has a number of different businesses. You could think of these as business units or even departments. And in those business units, there's a combination of internal meetings and events and external or commercial meetings and events. Today, because our topic is obviously going to talk about internal, we're going to look at event types, including investor meetings, town halls, departmental trainings, HR trainings, and DEIB initiatives. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but is a good representative list of the types of internal meetings and events that go on in most of our organizations today. Let's talk a little bit about what's possible to measure, starting with some of the objectives that we could have for internal meetings and events. At the end of the day, and this is really key on our journey to ROI and answering that question, what did we get for all of that time and money invested? We need to be able to associate our efforts to some really key objectives. These objectives are ones that your organization has for most every department, including the meetings and events function. How does this initiative impact productivity? How are we managing spend? How are we impacting employee engagement? How are we supporting onboarding and training, maintaining regulatory compliance, and managing risk? These are some very common objectives that we see in meeting and events programs for internal meetings and events. Each one of these objectives, and this is also not a complete or exhaustive list, comes with a set of metrics, those units of measure that are important to use to understand if we're meeting the objective. So for example, if your objective for your program is to impact productivity, you would look for things like quantifying the time saved as a result of someone attending a particular meeting or event, where we would look for improvement on that metric. For something like spend management, we might look at metrics that would include the total number of dollars managed by the program, how you're able to avoid cost, and how you're able to gain savings through your good spend management. So we're going to go into more detail on some of these as we go today. But first, let's just note that these are metrics, and to calculate the ROI for these metrics, there's a little bit of work involved. We will be talking about throughout the rest of our talk today how to calculate a value for some of these metrics that aren't completely clear to see. And that's really where the work needs to go into building an ROI story and an ROI model for your program and your organization. So that's what we're going to go through today. But first, I would like to get a quick pulse from the audience. Very simple question. What's your number one program objective today from this list? Is it to impact productivity in your organization? Is it to manage program spend? Is it to support and drive employee engagement? Are you supporting employee onboarding? Are you asked to maintain regulatory compliance or risk, or is there another? In our Q&A section at the end, we will see your results for our poll today. So back to Waystar Royco. Our CFO certainly would be interested in understanding if there are opportunities to get the meetings and events spend down. Our COO might want to increase productivity, and our chief legal counsel wants to make sure that our employees have taken all of the right trainings, but all of our stakeholders really care about driving employee engagement. So these are the three big themes that we're going to talk about today in terms of objectives. We could have picked from any of that menu of objectives, but these are three very common ones that we see organizations tackling. So that's what we're going to use as our examples today. How to manage spend, how to increase productivity, and how to drive employee engagement. So let's set up this talk with understanding how we're going to calculate ROI with a basic example of the ROI equation. The ROI equation that we're going to use today is the same one that many industries across the across business and across the world use to do very similar things that we're going to do. We're just applying it to our industry and our space. And the calculation is pretty simple. It goes like this. We take the total income from our initiative. We subtract the investment it took to get that income. We divide that by the amount of the investment, and we get ROI as a result. So as an example, if our income from our effort was $100 and our investment in the effort was $50, we'd have a $50 ROI. Then we divide that by the investment, and we get a decimal point, in this case, 0.1. We usually like to and want to express ROI as a percentage, so we'll multiply that by 100. And the ROI for this effort was 100% ROI on our investment. So pretty basic example. By now, you're probably thinking, so for my internal meetings and events, how do I translate this concept of income? Because most of our internal programs don't create income. So we're going to adapt the ROI equation and put it into terms for the meeting and event space. And it's pretty simple. We're going to replace income with benefits. And we'll talk about how to quantify the benefits just like we would income. Or we're going to replace investment with total cost. The rest of the equation is exactly the same. The benefits from our program minus total cost divided by total cost is ROI. That's our basic ROI formula. So let's look at the definition of costs for this exercise. When you think about both sides of the ROI equation, the benefit side and the cost side, we obviously have to understand the costs that are directly related to achieving that benefit. And worth noting, some of your programs will have different objectives and different benefits. So we want to isolate the costs as best we can down to that meeting or event that is different from one another. So the types of costs that we'll typically see, which should be no surprise to many of you: venue costs, food and beverage, programming, technology, staffing, travel. And they may also include some type of pro rata share of expenses that are across your program that do support any specific meeting, event, or program. So there's the ones that are directly related to an event or meeting, and then there's the ones that are shared across your department, where we want to look for the pro rata share. There's a whole exercise we could talk to you about on the best way to capture these costs. If you're using the CEDent budget module, we could pretty easily map these cost items to your budget categories, as you might guess. Okay, let's take a look at some of the benefits, and let's start to get into this concept of calculating a value. So for all of these objectives that we have talked about that have these metrics associated, the trick in calculating ROI and where the work comes in is developing a calculated value, a dollar amount for what we get for those objectives. So that's what we're going to talk about in detail next. Going back to our list of objectives, ideally we would go through all of these examples with you, but in the essence of time for our session today, we're really going to focus on three: productivity, spend management, and employee engagement. So let's start with spend management, where our CFO, again, really wants us to focus on getting the M&E spend down, which requires spend management, which requires us to understand the dollars that we manage, how to avoid cost, and capture savings. So again, we're going to use our formula, and we're going to focus in on cost avoidance and savings to calculate the value that we get to fill in the benefit line in the ROI equation. So I'm going to give you just an example. We're going to have a little make-believe and assume for a minute that we have calculated the benefit, the total dollars that we were able to avoid or save at $10 million. What if the total cost to do that was greater than the benefit? This is not a completely uncommon scenario. So starting with what's possible, but not necessarily a great ROI story. It may cost some organizations more to do the things that it's trying to do to actually save money. So there is a possibility to have a negative return. And we certainly don't want to have a negative return. So in this scenario, if we're not saving more than what it costs for us to do the work to save that money, this can result in a negative return. We want to avoid this. All of our ROI efforts, we want to at least be break even. And then later in our talk, we'll talk about what is the difference in a good ROI, an acceptable ROI, and outstanding ROI. Now let's just make believe for a second that we were able to avoid and save costs totaling $15 million. Our cost to do all of that in time, effort, people, agencies, technology, producing the meetings and events themselves was $11 million. So now we are in a positive ROI scenario. So using our formula, we take the benefit value minus the cost, and we have an ROI of $4 million and divided by that total cost, and we're at 0.36 times 100 to represent it as a fraction. So 36% ROI in this scenario. That's an excellent ROI. So let's shift now. That's a good example of spend management, and we'll go into a little bit more detail later. We're going to come back to productivity, but let's next go to employee engagement. Employee engagement is top of mind for every organization today. We are trying to find ways with workers going more remote to be engaged with our cultures so that we can have a positive impact in what we're trying to do. The meeting and events program should be considered a very key tool for most organizations in driving that employee engagement. So Jerry, our chief legal officer, while she wants to make sure that Roman got the training, she also, like all of our leaders, wants to drive more employee engagement. So let's tackle that one. So the benefits of employee engagement, and there are many that we're going to talk about. The number one that impacts cost is turnover. When employees are not engaged, they're much more likely to leave the organization. So there's great value in driving employee engagement. In fact, according to Gallup and the Harvard Business Review, organizations with a high level of engagement report 22% higher productivity. So we're going to talk about productivity in a moment, but there's a direct connection between engagement and productivity. So if you can use the meeting and events program to encourage engagement with your organization, it has a direct impact on productivity. This study also shows that highly engaged organizations have lower absenteeism and turnover, and organizations with high turnover report 25% lower turnover. So some organizations clearly have higher turnover than others. High turnover organizations have a benefit, and low turnover organizations have an even greater benefit, 65% lower turnover when employees are engaged. So these are some of the data points behind connecting the dots between the meeting and events program and employee engagement. So let's talk about how we're going to calculate ROI. As we saw in our part one, there are some data that you're going to need to get your hands on that someone in your organization should have. I'm going to reference some data from the Department of Labor, and your organization will have your version of these same metrics. So let's start with how would we think about the cost to replace an employee. The Department of Labor tells us that that estimated cost to replace one employee is 30% of that employee's annual salary. This can add up quite a bit over time. In this table, what you'll see at the top is a kind of a range of organizational turnover where 15% turnovers on the left-hand side and a whopping 100% turnovers on the right-hand side. And then on the vertical axis, you see the average employee salary ranging from the low of 15,000 to the high of 150,000. We're going to use this data set to do the calculations for our scenario around impacting employee turnover. You'll see in this chart that there's a low where the wages are low and the turnover is low that cost that organization $68,000 per year, and a high of $3.8 million a year, where the wages are high and turnover is high. There's a very large cost of employee turnover, obviously, stating the obvious. We're going to pick something in the middle. But first, let's look at the couple of metrics that you're going to need that your organization should be able to hand to you for this part of the calculation. You need to know your employee turnover rate. You can calculate it if you have the raw data. It's the number of employees that leave the organization divided by the total number of employees at the beginning of the period that you're measuring. Let's say it's a fiscal year. And you also need the average annual salary, the total salaries divided by the total employees. Most likely you're going to be able to get this from your HR department or your operations department, but you will need those two metrics to help us do this calculation. So back to the chart, we're just going to pick something in the middle. So we're going to assume 50% turnover and average wages of $60,000. This scenario costs that organization $810,000 annually to replace those employees. This is an extremely high cost. So with this 810, we can start to think about how we would leverage our internal meetings and events programs to drive engagement. Just think about this for your own organization. How do you encourage participation in town halls and trainings and DEIB initiatives? And do you see a relationship between more engaged employees and retention? At the end of the day, that's what this part of the ROI calculation is seeking to do. For our organization here, the business unit at Waystar Royco, that is losing over $800,000 per year in employee turnover, we should be able to assign a goal that you can create. And I would say in your first year doing this, if this is the first time, start at a very modest goal. In my scenario here, I'm going to say, could our program improve this by 25%? So if we really encourage participation in the meetings and events program, will that drive engagement? And will engagement have a positive impact on the costs of employee turnover? And I'm suggesting that we want to shoot for improving this by 25%. And if we did that, what we would see is we would reduce this cost by over $200,000. Let me go back and let everybody just see that. So a 25% improvement in that cost through better engagement from our staff and our meetings and events program could save the organization annually over $200,000. For some of your organizations that are large, this scenario is a smaller number than reality. And for those of you that are in a smaller organization, this is maybe close to reality. It's a large number either way. So what we do is we take that dollar amount that we're going to assume in our scenario that we did have success in retaining 25% more employees, which reduced the cost by over $200,000. That dollar amount for reduced turnover is the calculated value of the benefit. So we add the $202,000. We would calculate the total cost for the internal meetings and events programs I'm using an example of $150,000 here. That shows us a benefit, an ROI of 52,500. We take that and we divide it by our total costs, and we're left with a 0.35 decimal. And again, we like to express ROI as a percentage, so we multiply by 100. So our ROI that has a positive impact in the amount of over $200,000 in reduced turnover expense has a return of 35%. The same ROI formula using a calculated value for one of the benefits for one of the objectives of the internal program. So we're going to take a look at productivity next, but we can't take it all the way, and I'll show you why. I'm going to give you some of the scenarios that are possible, and then we'd love to take this conversation offline with you and address this on a case-by-case basis for your organization. So our COO, very focused on productivity, wants to understand our opportunities that we have in the meetings and events program to improve productivity. In this area, you really need to be looking at departmental trainings and HR trainings. And I'll come back to the reason why, but it's pretty intuitive. The things that we're going to teach our employees are usually related to helping them be a more productive employee or a higher performing employee, or both. If we can teach them how to use the tools they have better, if we can teach them a new skill, if we can teach them things through training, there's usually a good connection between those parts of your program and productivity objectives. There's 3 different methods that most of the industry would use to calculate productivity. And for each of your organizations, I suspect that some time and effort has gone into understanding which of these are in use. I would suggest that after I go through these and you understand them, maybe you reach out to someone in your operations leadership to see which is in use in your organization. The first method is called the quantitative method, and it's a pretty straightforward method. It's a formula used to measure employee productivity based on an input to output ratio. So the most common way this is used is how many hours of time does it take to create a specific output, whatever the output is defined as for that particular employee or team. Many organizations measure these types of things to understand what we are getting from our employees in terms of productivity for the amount of time invested to create the output. So your organization may use the quantitative method. The second method is the objectives method. This method uses very specific objectives or targets for individual employees. Once that objective is complete, maybe it's a project, maybe it's a set of tasks, the company evaluates the productivity based on the output. So this is done almost at an individual level based on something very specific that is assigned to an employee. Your organization may use this method. Last but not least is the task tracking method. This method focuses less on time and looks at just the quantity, the total number of tasks completed per employee. So for productivity, which is a little more complex but super important, you'll need to understand which of these methods is in use by your organization, and we could help you do some calculations to quantify the value assigned to the meeting and events program. Let's go back to our equation for a moment and start to add up the benefits that we have achieved in the 2 examples where we have the complete data. Starting with spend management, again, where our objectives were cost avoidance and cost savings. So in our example, we saved and avoided $15 million in total benefit, and it cost us to do all of that $11 million. And in the employee engagement example, we were focusing on improving the amount of employee turnover, which has a direct impact on the cost of turnover. And in that example, we saved over $200,000, and the program costs there were $150,000. So we can stack these benefits, and if we had the numbers for productivity And if we had the numbers for some other objective, we would just add these on top of one another to roll this up for the overall meeting and events program. So we add our benefits and we add our costs, and that total yields a total benefit of over $4 million in ROI for our program. We divide that by the total costs for each of these two items, and we result in a 0.36 or 36% total ROI, which is an outstanding return on investment. So hopefully this exercise has demonstrated to you that ROI does not have to be so scary. There's a very basic formula. Where the work has to go in is understanding how to calculate the value of benefits. Understanding the objective and understanding the benefit, what did we get for all of that time and effort, is where the work has to go on. And frankly, we need to graduate from metrics like attendance and satisfaction and focus more on ones that are quantifiable and ones that our business leaders will really expect us to use to defend investments in our programs. So we've talked about 3 different objectives today and the related metrics associated with those. Let's talk for just a minute about which systems where these data will live and where you'll need to access them. For any meeting or event program where Cvent is your event system of record, or you're using another event system of record, this is where you'll get all of the attendee data for the meeting and event programs where you're looking for that participation. Also, perhaps engagement in those programs. But you'll also need to have data from HRIS systems, perhaps work management systems for things like productivity. For an objective like spend management, hopefully you're using the Cvent budget module, but you'll also be looking for employee data in terms of participants from the HRIS system. You may also be using survey data here to understand some of the qualitative aspects. And last but not least, employee engagement. And these are all really related, very similar for all 3 of these. General ledger, ERP, I think those are actually reversed there, are more involved in spend management. Survey data gets into things like regular pulse surveys that most organizations are doing now on culture, where we can see our employees that are highly engaged in our meeting and events program also reporting out through surveys that they feel good about where they are in the organization today. So here are some metrics and data sources, because at the end of the day, not 100% of the data that you'll need comes from Cvent. And that's part of the challenge, and one of the reasons why it's not always as easy as we'd like to calculate ROI consistently. You've got to go find this data, partner with stakeholders in these other departments, but it's 100% worth the effort, obviously. So let's talk about our objectives and just ask the question, how did we do? We wanted to spend some time thinking about the different internal meeting and event types, trainings, onboardings, town halls, and hopefully you can understand now a little better around what's possible to measure. What did we get from those investments in doing those meetings? We talked about some of the key metrics and KPIs associated with productivity and engagement. If you use those examples and have the data, you will be able to very easily, in a straightforward way, build the right ROI model for your org based on the types of meetings that you do and your own data on assigning those values. We showed you the basic ROI calculation, which is exactly the same using the calculated values for each kind of objective area. And last but not least, hopefully this helps you think a little differently about how to set goals. If you can understand that you can truly have an impact on a business objective like spend management, you might set a different goal than you have been. Or if you can understand that you can now see how you're going to impact not only employee engagement, but how that translates to employee turnover costs, you might try to set a goal for that going into 2024. So that completes our programming today. Before we go to Q&A, I would again encourage you to please take our survey for the session. We appreciate your feedback. We take it seriously. We try to improve upon each time we do these with your input. And also just make you aware of some upcoming webinars that we have, including part 3 of this series, Demystifying Event ROI, where we're going to focus on event technology. Part of that expense for producing the internal meetings is to have the right technology. So we're going to isolate down on the event technology spend so you can tell a very specific story around return on investment for technology. So we hope you'll join us for that. So we're now going to go over to live Q&A and see the poll results and get into your questions. So thank you again. Okay, hi again, everybody. So that was our recorded portion. We're now live for Q&A. So thanks for everyone that has stuck around thus far. But let's look at the poll results. I asked the question, what is your number one objective today for your internal meetings and events program? We're showing that now. It looks like by a small margin, program spend, and managing program spend is number one, with employee engagement number two, productivity number three, and down at the bottom, program risk. So good responses, and some of your questions reflect this. So I have addressed or started to address some of the questions in Q&A where you can go to answer questions and see those. I'm going to start with a couple that we have not addressed yet. And could we visualize ROI for spend management? Could you further explain how you calculate the amount of the benefit? This is a really good question from Jenny. So in my examples, I showed that in my make-believe that we had totaled $11 million in cost avoidance and cost savings. That's a big number, first of all. Some of your organizations don't spend that much, let alone have the opportunity to save that much. But that number would be a goal that you would set for cost savings and cost avoidance. Let's say your CFO comes to you or your program leader comes to you and says, we need to reduce our meeting and event spend by 10% next year. That 10% might represent $100,000 in spend. It might represent $1 million in spend. And in our example, it represented, let's say, $11 million of spend. What we would be doing there is looking at our total spend across and our total budget across a period of time, usually a year. And we're looking for opportunities to avoid costs. What are some areas that if we make the right choices, we just don't have to spend money to get the same benefit from the program, and where we can save costs. So negotiate savings out of contracts with key vendors. So that number really represents the total amount of dollars that you were able to avoid spending or negotiate savings out. So that is a total benefit around cost avoidance and cost savings. That's how we arrived at that number. Everybody, in my opinion, should have an annual goal to manage as close to 100% of your spend as possible. So let's talk about that for a second. We can't really think about a goal for saving money until you have a really clear understanding around what percentage of your total spend you're actively managing. We have some customers, believe it or not, that are only actively managing about 50% of the total meeting and event spend that goes on in the organization, in part because different organizations, different teams are doing meetings and events that we don't get to see, that we're not actively involved in. So a good goal to start is to make sure you can see as close to 100% of the spend as possible, and then manage as close to 100% of the spend as possible. Once you understand what that total dollar amount is that you can actively manage and control, then you can set the right goal for cost avoidance and cost savings. And that's how, in my example, we would have arrived at that figure for Waystar Royco. They had a large amount of spend. The goal was to avoid and save $11 million. And I walked through a couple of those examples. For all of these questions, by the way, we'd be happy to go into more detail with you one-on-one. But that's a great question, Jenny. Let's go to another good one around benchmarking ROI. What's good and bad? Unfortunately, in our industry, we don't have great benchmarks yet. We're building these, and Cvent's playing, I think, a key role in this with all the data that we get to see. What we usually suggest to organizations is, first and foremost, start this process and make sure that as many of your meetings and events rolling into your entire program are at the very least break even. We want to be able to say that your ROI is at least 1% or greater before we can get into a scenario of comparing one meeting to another or 1 year of spend to another. At the end of the day, ROI for your organization is a bit like playing golf or perhaps swimming, where you're competing against yourself and you want to have some goals for your own organization to improve over time. I think that's probably more important than being able to benchmark against another organization where it would be perhaps very difficult to see the circumstances that organization is managing. But a good goal to start with is to start this process of measuring for the right meetings and events. Where we typically suggest that you start are meetings and events or programs, groupings of meetings and events, where just intuitively in your gut, are high visibility, high impact. They're getting a lot of attention. Sometimes we refer to these as tier 1 programs. Start there, pick one, and start to collect some of this data that perhaps you have not been collecting historically. Do it for one event, then do it for 2 events, and then try to capture these same metrics for one entire program, perhaps in your tier 1. And so very much a crawl, walk, run approach to getting started on ROI. We're going to give and share some templates, and we're also going to offer to the individuals that stayed all the way to the end today a complimentary workshop where Cvent Consulting can walk you through the templates and help you understand how to apply these and talk to you individually about what some of the challenges inside your own organization might be in getting started along this journey. And so hopefully you'll be able to take us up on that offer. But that's a really good question. I think over time we'll have more benchmarks available. Let's start with your own organization, improve what you can see, improve what you can control year over year. Okay, going to show this question, another good one. We should talk about spend management, referencing negotiation as a way to accomplish this. It's this calculation, how much you saved versus the original proposal, or how much you saved versus prior year spending. Good question. It's kind of both. You want to have budget versus actual is actually a KPI that we really like for spend management. You have a budgeted spend for any given meeting, event, program for your entire year, and you know what you're actually spending. So one, make sure that you're working to capture 100% of your actual spending. So if you have a budgeted amount that you would have applied to any given meeting, event, or program, you're going to be looking for ways to spend less than that budgeted amount. And in doing so across a year, we're going to try to get to that total, which hopefully is a goal for your organization that applies to the total annual budget. And so you need to be able to do both. It's what you have saved versus the budgeted amount. So when you look at your actual spend, you say, we actually spent less than the budgeted amount. Sometimes you'll take the budgeted amount before you go into vendor negotiation and contracting, and you have that budget in the back of your mind, and you're looking for ways to spend less than that. Sometimes you may not realize what that difference is until after the event. And as we all know, sometimes things are done on site where we are going to spend more than was budgeted and sometimes less than was budgeted. But anytime that you have a budgeted amount going into a negotiation process, we're trying to negotiate less than that budgeted amount and then roll that up across the period, usually a year, to see how you compare it against your total annual budget versus your total actual spend. That is a great example of a few different metrics. What was my budget? What was my actual spend? Those two metrics together create this KPI that we really like called budget to actual, which many of you may use. But if you don't use that KPI, that's a great one to start with in the spend management area. I'm going to go back and revisit one or two questions that I answered in the chat, but I think they're really important ones that apply to many of our organizations. I really like this question around factoring in employee development. If you have any role that you're playing in training, learning, and development, either at the departmental level or working with HR, you have an opportunity to impact employee development. Employee engagement also is very related to employee development. So we would typically apply some of the principles of training programs when we're thinking about employee development. Employee development at the end of the day is about teaching our staff a new skill or up-leveling them in some way. Perhaps we're introducing a new tool. Sometimes that might mean software. Sometimes it's making like managers more effective through managerial training. All of these efforts and cost that we're spending to develop our staff ultimately can be measured in output as improvements to their productivity. Did that new skill that they now have as a result of training have a material impact on their day-to-day job? So back to those productivity methods, which are admittedly not simple, not easy, but worth doing. If your programs have a big training component, I would encourage you to lean into this one. We could talk to you about how you would work with your operations leadership or your HR leadership to really understand what their goals for learning and the development are, what methods may be in use in your organization to measure productivity. But employee development will either be measured in productivity, and I outlined the three most common ways that organizations do that, or employee performance. If you teach an employee a new skill, you should be able to quite, in a straightforward way, measure the performance of that employee from one period to the next, prior to that training, prior to that learning and development initiative, to after that learning and development initiative. And then there are certainly ways to quantify the performance side as well. Productivity is a little more straightforward. But again, if you have training as a part of your program, this is an important one for you, and we would encourage you to lean into it, even though it'll take a little bit of work. One last one for today, because as we approach end of year and sales kickoff season, I wanted to make sure we get this question out there. If you are supporting a sales kickoff, this is a really good question. Sales kickoffs are internal meetings where we're really trying to do one or two things, usually both, in a sales kickoff. We want to motivate our sales teams to go into the year ready to perform, and they usually have a training component. The training component can be on something new that your organization is selling. It could be a new process that you're trying to implement that is intended to make the seller more effective or more efficient. It might be a new policy that you're trying to educate your sales staff on. But very similar to other training efforts, we would go back to those same metrics and KPIs for training. And in sales, there are a few different metrics and KPIs. There's a concept called time to ramp. Most sellers on day one may not be fully ready to sell your product or service. They need that training. So the more effective the training is, the shorter the time to ramp, which really just means how much time does it take for a seller to go from they've joined your organization or they have a new product to sell to they are ready to sell it. And so there are absolutely some key metrics and KPIs that borrow from that training side of the equation that we could talk about. Okay. Would you mind asking our staff to surface the one question that you're referencing? Okay, great. From Shazia. Hopefully I pronounced your name right. What strategy have you developed with the sales team so everyone is accountable for a successful event spend? So if we're talking about, and you can clarify for us, if we're talking about sales kickoff in terms of event spend, or just in general, where we're asking sales to support events where perhaps they are helping drive attendance. I think both are similar, but the way I would answer this question, Shazia, is if your meeting and events program is, if you have demonstrated that it has a meaningful impact on the sales team's objective, you're going to help them close business, then you have to position the event as one of those events in the year. Perhaps you do many different events where sales can contribute and participate. Yes, you have to convince them through data that their involvement in driving, let's say, attendance, if you're asking them to help drive attendance, or certainly follow-up, post-event follow-up, you have to demonstrate through data that events are, as a channel, one of the most high impact tools that they have as a salesperson. Salespeople have lots of different ways that they can do what they do to help make their number, but the live events channel, the data clearly shows, has one of the highest measures of impact on sellers being able to meet their number. So whether you're asking them to participate and help with getting their prospects to the event, or whether you're asking them to make sure they're doing timely and relevant follow-up, the data in the industry, and this is actually one where we do have benchmark data for the industry, the events channel is very effective in taking leads from events, if worked properly, into pipeline and into close. And so it's one thing to encourage them to do that, to be a good teammate. It's another thing to encourage them based on data. And this is one where you have data on your side that clearly demonstrates that it's worth their time and effort to be a partner to you in the meeting and events team, to both drive attendance and do timely and accurate follow-up post-event for leads, because we know that those leads are typically a higher likelihood to progress to pipeline and close than other channels. It's one of the best things that we can say about the meeting and events space. Okay, checking in. Do we have any other questions that we want to surface, team? If not, I think we'll close it here. Again, please take our survey. This is a really big, heady topic. This is 45 minutes. Love to take a deep dive with you. And as I mentioned earlier, we'd also like to extend the offer to give you a complimentary workshop. If this is a concept that you want to take further in your organization, please reach out to us. I think we're going to drop my email address in the chat. Reach out to me, and we'll have somebody from our team get in touch with you if you're interested in doing a workshop with Cvent Consulting. Thank you again. I look forward to speaking with you soon. Hope you have a great rest of your week.